You guys hear me? Can I hear you?
Hopefully, can you hear me?
There we go. Too many computers here. Sorry.
Council President, we are currently live.
Excellent. Good afternoon. We'll now begin with the Department of Housing and Community Affairs FY22 operating budget. Let me call on Fed Chair, Councilmember Reamer.
All right, thank you. And we are joined by Linda McMillan, who has prepared a packet. I'll ask Linda to walk through it. I think, the overall headline is there's more funding going into affordable housing, which is terrific. We have pinned down the Housing Production Fund as well as the Housing Opportunity Fund with viable models. We hope, and there is some additional work in this budget item related to facade improvements and things like that. But there's probably just one overall topic for us to discuss, and we'll see where council members want to bring it up. But Linda, why don't you take us through?
Okay. Good afternoon. I'll start with a very non-controversial part of the DHCA budget. The DHCA budget actually has three funds in it. It has the general fund, it has a grant fund, which is where community development block grant, home grant, and emergency solution grants monies are the main sources of funding. And then, of course, it has the Housing Initiative Fund or the Montgomery Housing Initiative. So the first items in the packet today that the committee reviewed were the items that are just a review of the first two funds, the general fund and the grant fund. As you'll see in the packet, there's very little change to the general fund or the grant fund. I would note for you that the grant fund is the normal sources of community development grants. It is not the coronavirus related ones. So the council has considered and will be considering large amounts of funding that are coming in through the Special Rescue Plan, CARES Act, coronavirus associated funding. Some of that comes through the Community Development Block Grant, but it is not included in this particular fund, which is why you see that there's very little change. And so the committee did recommend approval of those two funds as recommended by the executive. I would just say that in that discussion, there was an update on code enforcement, where the committee did get a brief update on code enforcement. During the pandemic, DHCA has not been able to do the proactive interior inspections of individual units that is part of the program that the council and DHCA have developed to try to deal with troubled properties. They did inform the committee that they have always been doing exterior and common area inspections, and they have been doing inspections when there's a life and safety issue or when it's needed for foster care or another required kind of inspection. But for both the safety of the tenant as well as the staff during the pandemic, the proactive inspections had not occurred. And so there was a discussion of DHCA staffing back up and getting back into those inspections. And the committee agreed that they would come back and look at that in the fall around the normal time that we would be talking about the troubled properties. And the committee also agreed to come back and have a discussion with the Common Ownership Commission about issues facing common ownerships. I think those are the major issues related to the general fund and the grant fund portion of the DHCA budget.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment here because this was probably the first discussion that we had where I learned that employees who may be fully vaccinated are not yet performing in-person services. And this is an example of a challenging aspect of this issue. We need inspections inside of housing to ensure that our community is safe. And those inspectors are supposed to be going into these communities for a reason. And the pandemic obviously the number of cases today is not at all what it was 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago. And so at what point here are we going to be resuming these in-person services? It's not just libraries and rec centers. It may be across the county government. I think we need to get a handle on this. So, generally speaking, we need to know when the executive branch is planning to resume all kinds of in-person services, but not inspecting housing, is an example of a very concerning aspect of our current operations. So just want to flag that for my
Right,
colleagues.
and I would also note that during the very beginnings of reopening in the pandemic, you will recall that DHCA code inspectors served as county ambassadors to businesses and went out and did a lot of work in the community to help businesses comply with the reopening rules. So they've been busy, but again, just not in the one proactive inspection area.
So
that move-
you want to see that return.
Lindy, do you mind if I just ask, when you say they've been active going back to health and safety, that's all on a complaint basis, right? Like where we had rampant unaddressed mold in the enclave in White Oak, and it resulted in the surge under, I think, candidate or nominee Elrich's DHCA, and it was very successful and found, widespread violations. Most of those were addressed, but I've heard and reported about a resurgence in mold there. I'm less worried about the one or two tenants that might have my cell phone number and more worried about the 99 that don't. Do you know if they've been doing spot inspections and how they have been responding to complaints from constituents? If they've gotten to those or if they've said, we'll get to those after the pandemic.
DHCA is on and they can respond, but my understanding is that when there is a complaint, there is a response, but it's the proactive inspection of units that was part of this whole restructuring of how we inspect multifamily that really has been the thing that has not been undertaken. But I'll let DHCA tell you more about how they've been responding to people with complaints.
Thanks, Linda. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Asim Nigam from DSCA.
Welcome.
Linda is correct. So we have been working on a complaint-based scenario. So if we receive a complaint, our inspectors will review that complaint. If they have to do virtual inspection, or they have been doing some common areas inspection as well. So, but if it's related to health and safety, which is, court ordered or otherwise, then our inspectors will go in. But it is correct that our inspectors have not been going on a regular basis inside the units to inspect. So we are working on a plan. This question came up during the Fed committee and we had some discussion. We are working on a plan with the county HR and will be working with the county health officer as well and the unions alike to come up with a plan how we can start going inside the units as we were doing it before.
So can you just help me understand? Thank you, Director Nagam. Your inspections have always been complaint-based, aside from in special initiatives like the surge that started around the beginning of your tenure. That was very successful. And so what kind of regular inspections would you be doing that have been foregone during COVID that were not complaint-based?
Okay, so on an annual basis, we do somewhere around 35,000 inspections per se. Because if you look at the troubled properties, and you mentioned one, previously,
right.
We do inspect 100% of the units. In other properties, we may inspect, 50% or 25% of the units, which may be on a 2-year cycle or 3-year cycle. So those are the kind of inspections which we have not been doing. And there's a backlog. And we hope that we can catch up, once we start doing the regular inspections soon.
Right. Okay. The ones required under the Tenants' Rights Bill from several.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Great. The troubled properties. Okay. Thanks for reminding me. Appreciate it. Thanks, Linda.
Okay. That moves us to issues related to the Housing Initiative Fund. In your memo, you will see that there's a summary table on page 2 of the cover memo. The executive is recommending about $89 million in all resources for affordable housing, acquisition, preservation, rental assistance programs, all the things that are funded both through the operating side and the capital side of the Housing Initiative Fund. There are some sources of funding that are unique to the coming year. That includes $6.8 million in one-time proceeds from land sales. There is a requirement when the county sells land with some certain exceptions that 25% of the proceeds be deposited into the Housing Initiative Fund, and you'll see that there were 3 properties where that 25% was directed to the HIF. So that is a one-time infusion of funds. In addition, the beginning fund balance is a little larger than was previously expected, which also adds to the overall resources that will be available in FY22. The summary also includes the long-standing capital improvements project that has been the capital side of the HIF. That's the Acquisition and Preservation Fund. It has had about $22 million each year. That was the executive's original appropriation recommendation, is $22 million a year in revenues that come from either the bonds that support this project or from loan repayments, but that total is at $22 million a year. That's on the capital side, and those funds are restricted to acquisition and preservation. On the operating budget side, there are other sources of revenue, including the general fund transfer, which is increased by the executive, as well as the recordation tax, which goes to support rental assistance programs. That funding source was discussed, and it'll be discussed again on Wednesday when we have the discussion of the homeless services budget, which is also funded in large part through the HIF. Recordation taxes, as you know, are projected to decline. We did discuss that because this can be a volatile source of funding, DHCA has been very careful over the years to always have contingency funds, and so there should be no difficulty in funding the requirements for the FY22 programs. Those are the general sources of funds to the overall $89 million allocation recommended by the executive. Council Member Reamer did note that included in the executive's recommendation is the funding needed for the HOC Housing Production Fund. And as you know, that requires that we show $3.4 million in funding each year to cover the cost of the bonds that are being issued by HOC, although there will be revenues coming back into the HIF. We expect about $1.7 million in FY22 that will come in from projects, but that has been fully integrated into the HIF by the county executive. And the second piece of that is that last year this time, the council decided to set aside $6.8 million that was programmed to be appropriated into the HIF and put it into a designated reserve specifically for affordable housing, so that the council would have the opportunity to consider the HOC Housing Production Fund and other initiatives. The council has used $500,000 of that in FY21 to initiate the HOC Housing Production Fund, and then $3.4 million of that is programmed for FY22 in the HIF. And so that leaves $2.9 million that is still in the designated reserve for affordable housing. And the Fed committee recommends that an FY21 special appropriation be approved by the council so that those funds can be moved into the Housing Initiative Fund to be used for affordable housing, as was always the intent. Okay. The next recommendation is to increase the allocation within the HIF that is for home ownership programs. For many years now, we've had $2 million of allocation within the Housing Initiative Fund to support loan and down payment assistance programs for eligible homeowners. The committee had an initial discussion about the importance of home ownership and some of these programs, and agreed that given especially the recommendation to put the $2.9 million back into the HIF, that we could allocate for this coming year $3 million instead of $2 million. That's a one-time change. It doesn't have to be built into a base forever. And then the committee agreed that they wanted to come back and have a further discussion about home ownership that would include a discussion of county programs, Housing Opportunities Commission, state and federal programs. And we had a brief discussion about the partnership that DHCA has with the State Department of Housing and Community Development to provide eligible homeowners both with forgivable loan assistance for a down payment, as well as allowing them to then access affordable mortgage products as well to help people of moderate means be able to access home ownership. The next recommendation is the recommendation around the Affordable Housing Opportunity Fund. And the Fed committee recommends, and this was a 2-to-1 recommendation with Councilmember Jawando opposed, approval of the $8 million for the Affordable Housing Opportunity Fund that is in the FY21 supplemental funding, but to hold the $6 million and to appropriate that instead into the Affordable Housing Acquisition and Preservation CIP project. It would, if it was appropriated to that project, be available both for short-term or long-term financing, but it would not be shown as dedicated to the Affordable Housing Opportunity Fund. The Affordable Housing Opportunity Fund is an initiative to have a new financing tool where the Department of Housing and Community Affairs would issue a solicitation. They would seek a partnership with a community development financing institution or a CDFI, and work with that CDFI both to identify at-risk properties and work for packages to preserve them. This both would preserve them in terms of affordability, but the hope is that if you target at-risk properties, you can also avoid tenant displacement through those acquisitions and preservation. This is a short-term or intermediate financing mechanism. So when this package is put together, it would be in place for no more than 3 or 4 years. And then when the permanent financing is put in place, the funds that the county contributed to any one project would go back into the Affordable Housing Opportunity Fund to revolve and be available again for these partnerships. Last year at this time, we also discussed the Affordable Housing Opportunity Fund, and council staff had shared with the committee and the council that there were a lot of unanswered questions about the structure of this fund, but the department has worked to be responsive to many of those questions so that it's now clear that the funds will be in partnership with the CDFI, but final decisions stay with the county. The funds stay with the county as a revolving fund. The expectation is that it will fill the final gap of probably 10%, maybe no more than 15% in any one project. And the expectation of the department is that partnering with a CDFI will bring new sources of financing to the table, as well as assist with market research to see if there are opportunities to preserve housing. I'll let the committee members speak, but I think the majority of the committee was concerned about whether this is the target for this financing, and that if it was put into the Acquisition and Preservation Fund CIP project and the full $8 million was accessed, the department would have the flexibility to put more money in from the Acquisition and Preservation project into these kinds of short-term deals. I want to be really clear that the committee recommendation does not take away any dollars from affordable housing or from the HIF overall. It only puts it into a different project which could be accessed differently. And I think with that, I would let committee chair speak to the
Thanks. I'll just try to thank you, Linda. It was a helpful summary, and your packet was very clear. Appreciate that very much. I'll just provide another overview of why we recommended the way we recommended it. The initial proposal from the county executive was different than what you're seeing now. The initial proposal required a different kind of budget mechanism, really a CIP mechanism, where that funding was going to be set aside and then banks were going to be asked to match it. And so the banks needed to know exactly how much money was going to be there. And, frankly, that strategy, it was focused on short-term financing, didn't get the strongest reviews from our affordable housing providers. There were some issues that were raised. We worked with DHCA. They revised the approach, and they've come forward with a new model that, we feel optimistic is going to work. Maybe it'll be a little different than what had originally been proposed. I know they've worked closely with the Enterprise Foundation in the process of trying to figure out the details. At the same time, it's not clear that it's necessary to devise the same kind of budget framework or item, because the grant that they will provide to the CDFI is the same as the grant that they might provide to MHP or HOC. It's money that they're providing to a partner who's then going to match that money with other money and make loans from it. And so the committee's recommendation is basically, you've got in the bank to start with $8 million. Why don't you go work with that? And then whatever else you need, according to the progress that you're making, you can consider that within the context of the HIF that you have. And it might be more, it might be less, but you'll have flexibility. But we were concerned about starting off this fund with $14 million right away, and then finding that it might take time. We don't know, but it could take time to spend that down. Meanwhile, projects that might need financing can't get them while money is being set, sort of sitting around underutilized. So we were trying to avoid that contingency because, again, it isn't really necessary to have the funds separated or segregated in the same way as it would have been under the initial proposal. So the recommendation that you have basically puts $8 million right off the bat into this special fund. DHCA, can work their way through that this coming fiscal year. If they want to appropriate more, or if they want to provide additional funds to it, they'd have that option. If they are, if they can't get it out, then at least they will not have, had that challenge with additional funding. So that's the recommendation that you have. And we could hear from colleagues in DHCA on it.
Right. Councilmember Jawanda.
Thank you, Mr. President. Appreciate the packet, and Linda, as always. This point for me, just for benefit of my colleagues, I think this is a very important tool, right? We've all talked about whether it be the Purple Line corridor, the idea of preserving affordable housing and avoiding displacement is a key part of the strategy, as well as production, as well as renter protection. And we always talk about, and I think rightly so, even if we don't always agree on the details of it, that you want to send a strong message and to the private sector, in this case, to the CDFIs, that this is all going to be available, and come back and match this 4-to-1 or whatever the match ends up being, so that we can preserve as much as possible. And when DHCA goes out with the RFP, that they can send that message. We have 14 million here. The issue of timing was brought up as well, and one of the reasons I supported the original proposal. It's also important to note that this is less than what was originally proposed before. I think it was 10 and 10. Linda, is that right? Last time it was
Yes.
20 million before, so this is overall. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, it was. The original executive recommendation was 10 and 10 last year, and through CIP reconciliation, it was reduced to 8 and 6.
Right. So I think that was another reason for me that, in talking with DHCA, they believe that this will send the strongest message, get the most interest, and allow. And the good thing is it's all going to affordable housing. the mechanism of removing money from the HIF, which is traditionally used for more long-term financing, and moving it over to this fund, it can be done. That's correct, but you have to do. My understanding is you'd have to do a CI, an amendment, and then they have to. How quickly could they do that, Linda? Do they have to? What process would they have to go through to do that?
I think there would have to be a transfer process that would come to the council, and it would be an amendment, probably take 3 or 4. I mean, it has to take 3 weeks. Usually they take a few weeks longer given just scheduling constraints.
Got it. Right. I knew it was some sort of process that needs to happen. It's not just a discretionary snap of the fingers. That was the other reason why I said, let's give them, and then if there's money left over, as we move to the fiscal year, we could always move more money to the HIF, again, for long-term financing, which is different. This is short-term. So I think it makes more sense to err on this side, which is why I took the position I did. I would like to move that we restore the council staff recommendation from committee that you get $8 million in FY22 and the $6 million in 23 to have the full $14 million.
It's $8 million in FY21 through the special.
I'm sorry. Yeah, 21 and 22.
$6 million in 22.
Yes. Thank you, Linda.
Second.
Okay, there's a motion from Councilmember Jawando and a second from Council Vice President Albornoz. Ms. Beck's trying to get in here.
Oh, sorry. I did want to just say on the transfers, there are some limits on the transfers, so that would be the only other thing to consider. So.
Oh, there's an aggregate limit?
There's a 10% of cumulative appropriation, and on this one, I believe it would be reduced by the prior cumulative. The prior spent, I'd have to look at that, but there would be a limit on how much could be transferred.
Another reason I think to err on that side. Okay, thank you.
Right. Okay, Councilmember Reed.
Okay, I just want to ask Linda, let's say the $8 million is in the fund and DHCA partners with Enterprise and they transfer the $8 million to Enterprise. That's the way the fund is structured. They provide it to Enterprise and then Enterprise combines it with other funding that they've raised and makes loans from it. That's my understanding of how it works. What is the reason that if they want to do additional funding, they can't just write a check to Enterprise just as they have done with MHP or HOC? They don't have to appropriate it through this fund. Like, this fund is technically unnecessary because all it is really doing is showing that we're going to give money to Enterprise, and we can just give money to Enterprise if Enterprise is the RFP winner.
Right. So first, I'd just say Enterprise is a terrific partner in the Purple Line corridor work, but they will issue a solicitation for a CDFI. So the way that this funding would work is that it would stay in the CIP project, and the CDFI would work and then would access from the county the gap funding. And so I will let DHCA speak to this, but my understanding is that the concern is that when you issue a solicitation to tell the CDFI, to put out there, this is what we are putting forth for these purposes, they will look at the size of that fund, which right now would be the $8 million in the FY21 as opposed to the $14 million. And DHCA believes that that could impact the responses from CDFIs. You are correct. I will say that if a housing partner was working with a CDFI right now and came to DHCA to seek some gap financing for something they would be putting together, DHCA could evaluate that and fund it from the HIF. But my understanding is that the concern here is that, and I think this relates to what Councilmember Jawando was talking about sending a strong message. DHCA wants to put out a strong message that there is this amount of funding for the CDFI so that when they're out doing market research, when they're out looking for these projects, they understand that they have this much funding to access through the county. And I think with that, I would let DHCA add to that or correct me if I'm wrong.
Thank you very much, Linda. And I thank the Fed committee members, our partners, and council staff for working on this concept for the last 1 year. And we have received some great input, and we were able to finesse our model as such. In terms of leveraging the money, as Councilor Javando mentioned, we do want to send a strong message. And we, based on our conversation with the financial institutions, will get better response if we have $14 million versus $8 million. And in the RFP, the way the committee's recommendation was structured, we cannot say $14 million. We'll have to say $8 million. And given the low interest rate environment, we want to create a structured financing tool which is robust enough for our partners, our developer partners, to act quickly in a timely and an efficient manner. That also being said, if we were to move $6 million to the opportunity fund, we have to go through the CIP amendment process, which will add to that timeline. So the whole point here is that, and the executive's recommendation is to move $14 million to the opportunity fund, and based on the discussion we have had with the financial institutions, we are reasonably sure that we'll be successful in attracting sufficient number of transactions for this financing tool. And if for some odd reason the department is not successful in attracting sufficient transactions, then the council can always reappropriate the money back to HEF, which can be used for other lending purposes. So we want to act in a timely fashion. So Linda, what you mentioned is correct. The money will stay with the county. We'll make our determination in consultation with the CDFIs as the money is lent out. And it's been revolving basis. There's no debt service getting paid from the county funds. So any interest or principal payment will be paid by the project. We are simply leveraging county dollars with the private dollars.
All right, let me summarize and pass it back. First of all, if DHCA wants to provide more funding for enterprise to do this work, they can just do that. They don't have to fund it through this CIP item. They could just provide it directly. And when they announce the funding, they could say, there's $8 million available now, and there's another $5 or $10 million, available for year 2 if DHCA wants to set aside that funding. That's the magic of the HIF. They have tens of millions of dollars that they can allocate however they see fit. So they can say what they want to say about funding being available. The distinction here is we wouldn't be locking that funding up and then having it go unused. It would remain in the HIF. And therefore, if this project isn't proceeding as intended or as hoped, it's there available in the HIF for other projects. It's really a hedge more than anything. But again, it is not necessary to use this funding artifice to provide funding to the program. DHCA could simply write a check to this partner and that money would be provided that way. So that is undergirding the committee's recommendation. Thank you.
So just a quick comment on that. Thank you very much, Councilor Reamer and Chairman for working with us. Just a quick comment here that if we were to do that, first, in terms of the certainty of the funds, CDFI will see $8 million. If future funds come in, those are future funds, but additional funding is not available at that time. So that's a key difference in terms of issuing the RFP. Second is, if we were to bring in additional funds based on consultation with the OMB and others, it has to go through amendment of the CIP process, which will take few weeks for sure.
But that's only if you, correct me if I'm wrong, Linda, but you only would have to go through the CIP amendment process if you wanted to find the additional funds through this specific housing opportunity fund. But you could provide funding directly to enterprise to do this work without appropriating it through this housing opportunity fund. That's what I'm saying. This is an artifice. I'm not saying that in a pejorative way, but it isn't strictly necessary from a budgetary perspective.
Before Linda chimes in, I will just say then in that case, we will not be leveraging the money that we'll be leveraging $8 million. We'll be leveraging $8 million based on certain parameters, and those parameters will be laid out in the RFP and the solicitations that we receive. So the other, whether it's $5, $6, or $10 million may not be leveraged the same way. So we want to create a tool going in with a bigger, financing. Linda, go ahead, please.
So the HIF funding can be used for short-term acquisition and long-term financing, can be used for all those things. So it is correct that if we had a partner with a CDFI and they came back and they said, I have this new project and I need another $2 million, could DHCA allocate $2 million from the HIF to finish that financing package? I don't see anything that would prevent them from doing that. I think that the different issue is the certainty for the CDFI of how much funding they have to work with as they plan working with their housing partners on different projects that they see out in the marketplace. And so that's really the difference in the signal, the message of the fund, as opposed to, could you allocate from the HIF if they needed some additional money? Yes, you could. That's not a question. It's a question of the certainty and the planning and how the CDFI would structure, I think, their work in looking for these projects.
Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you. First of all, appreciate the conversation. I'll just make a couple of comments here based on what the committee recommendation was for consideration of colleagues. I don't think this is as contentious as perhaps it seems. It's a different approach for this. I do agree that this fund is really a marketing tool more than a fiscal tool, and I think that there's some rational basis of making sure that you're putting out to CDFI partners, letting them know that money is available and having a name for a fund where the money is available. I understand where the executive branch is coming from on that purpose. I will note, as I said before, for an RFP to take place, by the time this program is up and running, based on what we heard during the committee work session, that wouldn't be until the second half of the fiscal year. At the earliest, we're looking at the winter months, so January, February, March, perhaps. Given that we're still in a pandemic and some of the challenges we've had in getting executive branch programs up and running during the pandemic, it could be later than that. But let's hope that it happens on an aggressive timeline with the county's RFP processes that have to take place. You're looking at the winter months. Originally, when this was proposed, the idea was to have two tranches of money, the first upfront and the second 1 year later. Currently, we're proposing to use fiscal year 21 money now. That would be to fund it as soon as we approve this, which would be in June for fiscal year 21. Then fiscal year 22 money would then be available a month later. On July 1st or less, literally a few weeks later. So we are accelerating the amount of funding that we are dedicating to this fund to sit and account for at least half of the fiscal year. And I would note that the proposal here is that this is recordation tax premium, which is cash in the capital budget. And so we are locking in cash into an account that can't be used flexibly for affordable housing for at least a half a fiscal year, maybe longer. If we do what the committee's recommendation was, which was to allow the executive branch to move forward with this program with the $8 million in fiscal year 21, two things would be available for the additional $6 million. Either the executive branch, without any CIP amendments or any changes, would be able to access the additional $6 million that would be flexibly left in the Affordable Housing Acquisition and Preservation CIP, which is one of the most flexible accounts that the county has in the capital budget to use for anything housing related for preservation and acquisition. Certainly this fund, anything this fund is doing would qualify for that. or most likely, and this would be more along the lines of what the original timeline was for the second tranche, it could be allocated in fiscal year 23, which would be the same timeline, save a couple of weeks from what the original proposal was, with the second tranche of recordation tax premium money could be funded in this in the next budget cycle. The executive branch still could advertise that there's up to $14 million available in the context that that funding could be allocated exclusively with executive branch decisions on the use of the acquisition and preservation CIP, and add that money in if for some unlikely scenario they're able to get this up and running in a much shorter time frame and able to get projects out the door much faster than expected. If that doesn't happen, then this money would be available for other affordable housing projects that we know are desperately needed right now, and we wouldn't be locking in all $14 million into an account that's not even going to be able to start to be accessed for at least half of the fiscal year. So I think that the committee's proposal is a more prudent way to allow the executive branch to move forward with this program while not tying up all of the funds in an account that won't be used at least for 6 months and most likely for longer. So, I just wanted to note that it really is, a different approach to this, but the question is about flexibility to meet our shared interests and our shared goals that everybody is on board with. And I think the committee's recommendation is the more fiscally prudent approach to handle this while being able to achieve the exact same goal on a almost identical timeline to what was originally proposed by the executive branch at the outset. Thanks, Mr. President.
Council Vice President Albertine.
Thank you. Well, first, this feels like an acronym party. HOF, HIF, DHCA, CDFI. There's a lot going on here. But let me just begin by acknowledging the committee's really great work on this. The headline here is important. Montgomery County is aggressively trying to pursue affordable housing. And I think based on the county executive's recommendations within this budget and the committee's great work, we continue to move in the right direction. And as we've all been noting, there are some very serious issues on the horizon that we must address and address as quickly as possible. And I want to start where Councilmember Friedson started, which is that there's a lot more agreement here than there is disagreement. There's just slight derivations in the strategy, but a little bit feels like 6 of one, half dozen of the other, because if the funding isn't utilized, it gets cycled back into the HIF. So keeping it into the HIF and then cycling it in, I mean, I know that's an important distinction, but as Councilmember Friedson also noted, this is primarily a marketing tool. And I think this is a very creative way for us to aggressively pursue these projects. And timing on these projects is really important because they often don't align and there's a lot of complexities as these projects become available. And having more tools in our toolbox from DHCA's perspective in their partnership with CDFI puts them in a better position to be able to move these projects forward. And I think we're uniquely positioned here right now with interest rates continuing to be as low as they are. And I think that there's going to be some more opportunities for projects in the near term. And so for those reasons, I support the amendment because I think it puts us in a better position to secure those projects. And if we're not successful, then the funding gets cycled back in anyways. That for me is an important distinction as well. So I do appreciate GHCA's work, which has been recognized by the chair as well as council staff in making great strides thus far in addressing some of the understandable questions and concerns regarding this approach. But I feel, as evidenced by the committee recommending $8 million, that a lot of those concerns have been allayed. And if we give them an additional $6 million of flexibility, I think that could produce some additional projects that may not have had the same opportunity otherwise. So For those reasons, I'm supporting this amendment and don't believe there's as much disagreement as maybe it appears from the outside looking in.
Sorry, Councilmember Katz.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you to the committee and all involved, and Ms. McMillan as well. I too agree that we're probably more in agreement than we're in disagreement, but we're talking about the part that we're not in agreement on. And candidly, I believe that we need this additional funding. Let me see if I can quiet that down. The bottom line is, and I think Councilmember Friedson is absolutely correct, that we're probably 6 months away from when we would see these funds and the time frame associated with it. But the reality is, if we don't do it now, whenever we do it, we're going to be 6 months away from when we can get these additional funds. And if an opportunity happens, I believe, for whether it be for marketing or for with our partners or for everything associated with it, I believe that we need to send that message that we are here. And I believe these additional funds would certainly go a long way to send that message. If it's realized that we don't need these funds, and candidly, I hope we do. I hope that the 6 month time frame can be shortened to a much better time frame. But if we don't use these funds, which there again, I hope we do, but if we don't, it would be easier for us, in my opinion, to change to send the funds back than it would be to set the funds up. So I believe I'm going to be supportive of this amendment. I believe this is the way to do it. And hopefully we're sending a message that says we want this to be done as quickly as possible, and to thank our partners for working with us. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilmember. Anybody else want to speak on this?
I was on the list, Mr. President.
Councilmember Rice.
Yeah. Just want to add my continued support. Tried to second, but certainly a third or fourth, it doesn't matter. Linda, when you said about, and I just want to make sure that I understand this, alleviating the pressure on the HIF. Can you just talk about that again and the strategy regarding short and long-term financing, just to make sure I understand what our overall strategy will be in being able to utilize this versus where we'll be able to strategize using the HIP when it comes to short-term versus long-term?
Yeah. So these funds, whether it's 8 million or 14 million, but these funds that would be set aside in the Affordable Housing Opportunity Fund would be restricted to a short to intermediate time frame. So they would allow for hopefully faster acquisition because of certainty of knowing those funds are there, and would fill the gap. Again, DHCA, and we all hope that partnering with the CDFI more closely will bring new sources of funding to the table, but it would fill the gap in that financing and allow for the acquisition.
So thank you, Linda, because what I wrote down is faster acquisition, fill the gap, and new sources to add into the mix. Those are key takeaways. Those are, and for me, those are things that are important for us as we look at our overall strategy.
Right. And so, the HIF has been able to do both short and long-term financing, but it is not set aside for that certainty for acquisition. And I believe that is part of the reason for this proposal, which is to make sure there is some certainty around that source of funding.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Millen. I appreciate your opinion and guidance as always, and I will be supporting this amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Councilmember Namato.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also want to thank the committee for their work. I think that the length of this discussion on this particular amendment really demonstrates the commitment that both this council and the executive has on moving the needle on this issue of housing, specifically affordable housing. I think that we've made some really incredible, bold moves that will be, I think, very helpful in getting us to where we want to go eventually. And so in this particular instance, I also believe that the executive has the prerogative also to put forth particular strategies. This is a particular strategy. It's not the end all be all. I don't think this is the end. Obviously, if we believe that we need to add, if we think that there might be some interesting, projects coming through and we don't have enough funding, that, we can revisit things. But it seems to me that we have in place a number of important strategies and important tools. And so, staff, I think council staff had it right originally. And if we need to revisit, we can. So I feel that the original recommendation was the way to go, and therefore I also would be supporting the amendment.
Terrific. Okay, anyone else? Okay, thanks to the committee for the great work on this. We have a motion on the table. All those in favor of the motion to restore the $6 million to the original proposal, please raise your hand. That is Councilmembers Katz, Councilmember Albornoz, Councilmember Glass, Councilmember Navarro, Councilmember Joando, Councilmember Rice, Council President Hucker. All those opposed? Councilmember Friedson, Councilmember Reamer. Okay, motion passes 7-2.
All right. Again, I think probably a distinction without a difference. In the end, hopefully, if they can get this funding out, it won't matter. So let's all keep our eyes on that. Okay, so moving back to the packet, we now proceed to the final issue in there. We were talking about pilots, right, Linda? That's the next item here.
Yes, and I did just want to say under either proposal, the Fed committee did request that there be written reports December 1st and then next April on the Affordable Housing Opportunity Fund, so that and in the packet it highlights some of the things that would be in those reports so everybody can evaluate its progress. So I just wanted to put that out there as well. And then Councilmember Reamer is correct. The next issue is the payment in lieu of taxes. And the council under current law is required to set limits on payment in lieu of tax agreements that are not for Housing Opportunity Commission payment in lieu of taxes or pilots. This also is not related to the WMATA change that you also made recently. This is existing law. And so there are recommendations in the packet for that 10-year limit. And I know that the committee wants to come back to this and talked about coming back to look at the current law and possible amendments.
Yeah, we want to, we've been talking about it for some time, but with COVID, everything has just been slowed down because of bandwidth. But legislation that would entitle nonprofits or any housing developer that meets certain thresholds for affordability to claim pilots or tax abatements, just simplifying their process, providing them with certainty if they want to go out and acquire a property. So that would be separate legislation, and we've asked for a draft, and hopefully we'll get it soon. So thanks.
And I think those are the key issues that the committee brought forward to the council for these items in the budget. And then you have a second packet that addresses the two CIP projects of the community planning and also the facade easement.
So should we vote on these then as a straw vote before we move on, Linda, or just keep it all together? There's no controversies in the other items, so we can keep it all together.
Okay. So there are two amendments that came over from the county executive. The first one is to reduce the current revenue in FY22, and this is for fiscal constraint reasons for the project that is community development specifically for the department. This funding is used when the department is doing studies to determine if later projects may be able to be funded through community development block grant or other sources, but it's important that they be able to do these studies with general funds that don't have restrictions that some of the federal funding has. And so for FY22, this would leave $50,000, but it retains then the $125,000 in the out years of the CIP, and the committee recommended approval of that. And the second is a change, and in fact, it's the second change to the countywide facade easement improvement program. And the March amendment actually is accelerating some of the funding because there is an interested property owner in the Hillendale area who wants to move forward with this program. This is a countywide program, but the PDF does note some target areas that include Montgomery Village, Hillendale, the Wheaton Central Business District, amongst those. The committee did have discussion to clarify that even though the PDF discusses the opportunity zone, that it's not limited to opportunity zones, that was put in the language because it may mean that if it's in an opportunity zone, we could also look to access certain other sources of funding. So there is no limitation there. And also there was a discussion about the Hillendale area and clarification that the west side of New Hampshire Avenue that has some of the older shopping centers is indeed one of the eligible areas. And so the committee did recommend approval of the amendment.
All right, there you have it, Mr. Council President.
Thank you. Thanks for your attention to Hillendale, in particular the west side of New Hampshire Avenue.
Thank you.
It's been frozen in time. Okay. With that, we have a committee recommendation in front of us. Mr. Chair, any final amendments? Okay, then all those in favor of the committee recommendation. Thank you, Ms. McMillan. Please raise your hand. That is unanimous. Terrific. All right. Are we on to the Office of Agriculture?
I think so.
Okay.
All right, I'll turn it to council staff. We did have one little tweak here that will help some of our farmers get access to additional capital funds. We can talk about that. But you know, yet another productive discussion with our Office of Ag. Jeremy Chris and Mike Shuffle joined us, and you know, they do a lot with a little, and we're appreciative of that very much. So again, you know, the only difference we're proposing, and everyone actually got a report from the agricultural, might have been the advisory board, I'm not sure, Jeremy will certainly tell us. But there is last year we allowed the office to repurpose some funding from programs that they could no longer implement to a grant program that matches state funding. And that money gets repaid. It's actually a loan program. That money gets repaid. Was both a grant and a loan program, I guess. And so we're suggesting that the repayment really should be returned to its original purpose of providing grants. And so there's just a little bit of a tweak in the budget recommendation. So council staff, and then we'll turn to the Office of Ag.
Thank you, Mr. Reamer. I'll be brief. The committee did recommend approval of the executive's appropriation for the Office of Ag as recommended, in addition to the one recommendation to category 3 for $25,000 for the MBIDCO cost share program. This seemed to be the simplest solution to provide the correct funding for the Office of Ag, rather than hoping that the money, as MBIDCO reimburses the county, it goes to the general fund and then gets transferred back to the Office of Ag. The committee's recommendation just simplifies that process and gives them the correct amount of expenditures so that they can focus programs beyond just MBIDCO. Staff will note the other items the committee did discuss is one of the fan favorites of the council and of the county is the ag in the classroom. We'll be back this year as MCPS returns to in-person instruction. That was reduced during the savings plans in fiscal 21, but that will return. And then, as always, the committee will return to continue to look at how to best bolster and support the Office of Ag and all of its work. Because, as you said, it's a rather small budget, but they do mighty work with very, very few staff. And so the committee will continue to look at that and how to support the Office of Ag. Thank you.
Thank
Jeremy,
you.
do you want to add anything?
Yeah. Mr. Chris?
I'm sorry, do you want me to go now?
Sure.
Well, thank you, County Council, and for helping us in the Office of Agriculture. We are really proud of the success that we've had with our matching grant program. And we just wanted to make sure that you were aware of how we use the money for many of the programs that we weren't able to do because of COVID, and that we're really hoping that those programs we're going to be able to resume them. So therefore, that makes less money available for our matching grant program for FY22. So whatever we can do to address that environment would be very helpful. And we shared with you our progress report on the matching grant program so that you can see the testimonials from the individual farmers that received very small amounts of money for very important projects, 27 total investment of about $496,000 for the combined county and state matching grant of $134,000. So we hope to continue to replicate that success moving forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chris. Okay, we have a committee recommendation in front of us. Well said. All those in favor of the committee recommendation, please raise your hand. That is unanimous. Great. Okay. Colleagues, anything else? Mr. Chairman, anything? Did we leave anything out? Okay.
I don't think so.
I think we'll see everybody tomorrow. Thanks for all your good work.